The notebook hit the wall at 9:47 in the morning. It made a flat, sharp sound, not dramatic, not loud, just the sound of something being dismissed. Pages separated from the spine and fell across the floor of the command briefing room in slow, careless arcs. Months of ballistic calculations. Wind readings taken at dawn and dusk across 6 different terrain profiles. Firing angles calculated to the quarter degree. Every number Sarah Voss had run in the hours when everyone else was sleeping laid out now across the dirt floor of a forward operating base in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. 20 officers watched it happen. Not one of them moved, not one of them bent down, not one of them picked up a single page. Colonel Stanton Brielles turned back to the projected map on the wall and continued his briefing as though the notebook had never existed and the woman who carried it had never spoken. 47 hours later, those same officers would be pressed against burning vehicles in a kill box in the Helmand Valley, bleeding into Afghan sand, praying to versions of God they had mostly forgotten, while the woman they had just watched get silenced was the only reason any of them were still drawing breath. But that comes later. This is where it begins. Sarah Voss grew up in a town outside Abilene, Texas, where the horizon goes on forever in every direction, and Friday night football is as close to religion as most families get. It was the kind of place where the military was not a career choice so much as a family inheritance, something passed down through generations, the way other families pass down land or debt, or the particular silence that settles over a dinner table when something important is never going to be spoken aloud. Her father had served, her uncle had served, her older brother Marcus had done 2 tours in Iraq, come home with a Purple Heart and a knee that would never bend right again, and kept both of them in a shoebox under his bed that no one in the family was permitted to ask about. He worked at a hardware store now. He watched football on Sundays. He never talked about what happened over there, and the family had learned that his silence on the subject was not an invitation. Sarah enlisted at 19. She did it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with a cup of coffee going cold beside her and her mother washing dishes in the next room. She signed her name in her careful, slightly too small handwriting and set the pen down, and that was that. No ceremony, no announcement, no moment of grand decision-making that she could point to later and say that was when everything changed. It had already changed. She had already decided. The signing was just paperwork. She was 5'4". She had brown hair she kept pulled tight under her cover, green eyes that didn't miss much, hands that were slightly too calloused for a woman her age, the result of repetition so sustained it had become indistinguishable from instinct. She was not the loudest person in any room she entered. She was not the most aggressive. She did not perform confidence or manufacture presence. What she had, the thing that her drill instructors would later discuss in the specific private language that instructors use when they encounter something genuinely unusual, was patience. Not the patience of someone waiting for something to happen. The patience of someone who understands that the moment will come and who has prepared so thoroughly for that moment that preparation and waiting have become the same activity. She excelled from the beginning. Rifle qualification, land navigation, physical conditioning. She was not always first, but she was always precise, and in the long run, precision outlasts speed in almost every situation that actually matters. Her instructors noticed. They wrote notes. The notes said things like consistent under pressure and exceptional trigger discipline and demonstrates situational awareness beyond her experience level. The notes went into a file. The file got thicker. Then she applied for the Marine Corps Scout Sniper Basic Course. The Scout Sniper Basic Course is without any exaggeration one of the most brutally demanding training programs in the American military. The dropout rate in most classes runs between 60 and 70%. Marines who have survived multiple combat deployments have voluntarily walked off that course because they could not sustain what it demanded. The physical component alone eliminates candidates who are objectively fit by any standard a civilian would recognize. The mental component eliminates people who have survived the physical component, the stalking exercises, the observation requirements, the sleep deprivation. It is a course specifically designed to find the people who will not break when everything around them has already broken. Sarah did not break. She graduated in the top 10% of her class. Her final qualification score drew the attention of Gunnery Sergeant Dale Hooper, a 20-year veteran who had instructed the course for the better part of a decade, and who had the specific professional detachment of a man who has seen enough exceptional performance that he no longer gets impressed by it easily. He got impressed by Sarah Voss. He wrote in his formal assessment in the precise institutional language of a Marine Corps evaluation that her performance represented, and he chose these words deliberately, because Hooper was a man who chose words deliberately, among the most precise long-range marksmanship I have evaluated in 19 years of instruction. He also wrote in smaller handwriting at the bottom of the page, almost as though he was embarrassed to include it and more embarrassed to leave it out. Recommend immediate frontline deployment. Sniper of significant operational value. That recommendation entered the system. It did not come out the other side. It went into a file that got thicker, and then the file got a classified attachment, and then the classified attachment got a designation that Sarah would not learn about for a long time, Ghost 7-2. And below the designation in the specific formatting used for high-value personnel who had been removed from operational rotation for reasons that the institution preferred not to explain in plain language, a single administrative note removed from frontline rotation following internal political review. Reinstatement denied at command level. Performance metrics redacted from standard personnel file. Sarah knew none of this. She only knew that Hooper's recommendation went nowhere, and that 6 months after graduation, when she filed a formal complaint against a superior officer for falsifying range scores to exclude her from an advanced deployment rotation, the investigation lasted 11 weeks and ended with the officer receiving a written counseling statement, the military equivalent of a strongly worded letter, while Sarah received a lateral transfer. The transfer took her to Helmand Province, Afghanistan, as a communications specialist attached to a rifle battalion. Her sniper qualification remained on file. The Marine Corps does not erase records. But her operational role was as far from a sniper's hide as you could get, while still technically wearing the same uniform. She answered radios. She formatted convoy manifests. She updated atmospheric conditions for operations she was not permitted to participate in. She did all of it with the thorough, unhurried attention that she brought to every task she was given, because Sarah Voss was a person who believed that the quality of your work was not something you adjusted based on whether anyone was watching or whether the work deserved your effort. The work deserved your effort. That was the principle. The audience was irrelevant. At night after her shift, she went back to her bunk and opened the green notebook she had carried since sniper school and ran her calculations. Wind speed, atmospheric pressure, elevation adjustments. She calculated shots she had not taken and might never be permitted to take. She maintained the mental sharpness for a role the institution had decided she was not allowed to perform. She had been doing this for 7 weeks when the name started. Corporal Ty Garnett was 22 years old from a town outside Augusta, Georgia, and he had the particular confidence of a young man who had never been told no by anyone whose opinion he valued. He was broad-shouldered and loud in the specific way that certain young men are loud not aggressively, just habitually, as though volume were a personality trait rather than a choice. He had been on the base for 3 months when Sarah arrived. Within a week he coined the name. He was sitting in the chow hall not looking at her, looking at his food when he said it to the man beside him. With the easy throwaway delivery of someone testing a line they already knew was going to land. What is the dead weight for exactly if she can't even carry a full combat load? 3 people laughed. That was all it took. The name moved through the forward operating base the way names move through small, closed communities invisibly, effortlessly, until it was simply part of the atmosphere, something everyone breathed without noticing. They were breathing it. Dead weight. It preceded her into rooms. It followed her out. It was said to her face on some days, and not said but present on all the other days, which was in many ways worse. Sarah said nothing. She had learned through the formal complaint and the 11-week investigation and the lateral transfer that arrived in place of any actual resolution that responding to it only made the fire spread faster. So she was quiet. She was disciplined. She cleaned her rifle every evening, even though she had no official reason to keep it ready, because a sniper who stops maintaining her weapon is no longer a sniper, and Sarah Voss refused to stop being what she was simply because the institution around her had decided to pretend she was something else. Staff Sergeant Cal Pruitt was 41 years old on his 4th deployment, and he had the quiet, settled authority that comes not from rank, but from the simple, undeniable reality that he had been in more dangerous situations than almost anyone else on the base, and had come through all of them without losing his judgment. He watched Sarah for 6 weeks before he said a single word to her. What he saw made him thoughtful in a way he found difficult to articulate. He had been in the Corps long enough to recognize the specific kind of waste that happens when an institution mistakes a person's category for their capability, when the assumptions built into a system become more powerful than the evidence that contradicts them. He had seen it before. He had not always known what to do about it. He found her in the armory 2 days before the Valley operation, cataloging ammunition with the focused attention of someone who considers every component a variable to be controlled. He leaned in the doorway and asked if she had read the mission brief. She said she had transcribed it and formatted it for distribution. He asked if she had thoughts. She set down the round she was cataloging. She picked up her green notebook not to read from it, but as though holding it organized her thinking, and she told him what she saw in the terrain data. 4 machine gun positions that a competent enemy commander would have established in that valley if he had been given 11 days to prepare. 11 days of signals intelligence suggesting enemy movement in the area. A ridgeline configuration that created a natural bowl with no viable exit routes under sustained fire from elevated positions. A kill box, she said. A textbook one. Pruitt was quiet for a long time after she finished. He asked if she had told anyone. She told him she had raised it with Colonel Brielles during the briefing preparation. He asked what Brielles had said. Sarah looked at him with the steady, measuring patience that was her most fundamental characteristic. He told me to stick to the radio, she said. Pruitt exhaled slowly through his nose. He looked at the floor. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at Sarah, the way a man looks at something he knows to be true and wishes with genuine force was not. He told her he would try to get it escalated. She asked through what channel. He did not have a good answer, and they both understood that. "Get some rest, Carter," he said finally, then corrected himself quietly. "Voss, get some rest." She nodded. After he left, she sat alone in the armory for 2 more hours, finishing the ammunition log and running her ballistic calculations one final time because she was a person who prepared for the things she could not prevent, and preparation had always been the only form of control she had left. The briefing the following morning was the one that would matter for the rest of everyone's lives. Colonel Stanton Brielles stood at the front of the room before a projected map of the Helmand Valley, unhurried and assured in the manner of a senior officer who has already made his decision and is conducting the briefing primarily for procedural reasons. He was 53 years old, 26 years in the Corps. He had ribbons that Sarah had studied because she studied everything, and he carried the institutional weight of someone who has spent so long being correct about things that he has lost the ability to distinguish between experience and certainty. He called it a sweep and clear operation. Light resistance anticipated. Move through, establish patrol presence, return to base. Clean and simple. Sarah was in the back of the room. She was required to be there as the senior communications specialist for the pre-operation briefing. She was not expected to speak. She raised her hand. Brielles saw it. He continued speaking for 7 full seconds before he acknowledged it. Sarah counted and then said with the particular flatness of a man who has decided that patience is the most elegant form of condescension, Sergeant Voss. She stood. She did not rush. She held the green notebook in her left hand and spoke with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything she did. She outlined the ridgeline configuration. She described the natural bowl formed by the eastern and secondary western ridges. She identified the 4 positions a competent enemy force would have established in 11 days of preparation. She connected the signals intelligence to the terrain and arrived at the same conclusion she had reached in the armory. Said aloud now in front of 20 officers. This convoy route enters a kill box with no viable retrograde under fire. Brielles looked at the notebook. "Is that a personal notebook, Sergeant?" "Yes, sir. The terrain data is from official. So these are your personal calculations." The room was watching. 20 officers, most of them working very hard to look neutral. Sergeant Voss, Brielles said, and his voice had shifted into something that was not quite amusement and not quite contempt, but occupied the precise space between them. "This is a battalion briefing. Unless you have official intelligence assessments to contribute, I would ask you to save the personal project for your own time." Laughter. Not loud. Specific. The kind of laughter that exists in institutional settings when the authority figure gives permission to dismiss someone small. Complicit sounds that are less about humor than about allegiance. Brielles took 3 steps toward her and picked the notebook from her hand. He threw it against the wall. The sound it made was flat and sharp and somehow smaller than the silence that followed it. Pages left the spine. Ballistic calculations and wind readings and firing angles drifted down across the floor in slow arcs, coming to rest in the dust. 20 officers watched. Not one of them moved. Not one of them bent down. Sarah sat. She was still. She did not look at the notebook on the floor. She did not look at the men who had not moved. She looked at the projected map on the wall, and she traced the convoy route with her eyes one more time. The approach road, the valley floor, the ridge lines closing in on both sides, and she thought about what she knew and what was going to happen because of what no one else was willing to hear. Corporal Garnett passed close to her chair on the way out and said quietly to the man beside him, "Good thing dead weight doesn't get to plan missions." The man beside him made a small sound. Sarah looked at what remained of her notebook on the floor. Then she looked straight ahead. She wrote one line from memory in the small notepad she kept in her breast pocket, using the calculations she no longer needed to reference, because she had run them so many times they had become part of her elevation 2,340 feet. Wind 8 miles per hour, northwest. Primary engagement distance 960 to 1,100 meters. Light conditions favorable. She put the notepad away. She stood. She walked out of the briefing room with the same unhurried stride she always carried, the stride of someone who has somewhere to be and does not need to announce it. The room emptied behind her. In the hallway, she paused at the trash can outside the briefing room door. She did not look around. She did not hesitate. She simply reached in and retrieved the green notebook, the pages she could reach most of them, and tucked it inside her uniform against her chest and continued walking. No one saw her do it. The notebook that had been thrown away, the months of calculations that had been dismissed as a hobby in front of 20 witnesses, went back into the uniform of the woman who had made them. And it would stay there against her chest for the next 47 hours, while a convoy of 480 Marines drove toward a valley that Sarah Voss had already mapped in precise, careful, devastating detail. She watched the convoy leave from the entrance of the communications tent. She stood in the doorway and watched the vehicles form up in the early morning light, the specific busy noise of a large unit preparing to move engines, turning over equipment being checked, the low-frequency hum of men who believe they are going somewhere manageable. She watched the lead vehicle pull out. She watched the column extend and begin to move. She watched the last vehicle disappear over the ridge. She watched the dust settle behind them. Then she went inside and sat at the radio console and put on her headset and began to monitor the traffic. She was not waiting for something to happen. She was listening for the way silence sounds before everything changes. She had learned over years of training and the particular education of being more careful than the people around her that the moments before catastrophe have a specific texture. Not dramatic, not loud, just a series of small deviations from the expected rhythm, a transmission that arrives a half-second late, a voice that carries a flatness inconsistent with the words being spoken, a gap in the traffic pattern that the protocol should have filled but did not. She heard it. At 1419, while the convoy was still moving through the approach road and the radio traffic was still the ordinary administrative noise of a unit in movement, Sarah Voss heard the silence that comes before a flood. She stood up. She removed her headset and set it down carefully on the console. She walked to the back of the communications tent where she had stored her rifle case 7 weeks earlier when she arrived, and had nowhere else to put it. And she picked up the case and she checked the lock, and from the equipment rack beside the door, she took a handheld radio and clipped it to her belt. Private Bo Whitmer looked up from his console and saw her with the case. He did not say anything. He did not understand what he was seeing. Sarah walked out of the communications tent into the afternoon light. Nobody stopped her. 2 people saw her go and neither of them moved because neither of them believed, not for a single moment, not with any part of the certainty that comes from actually paying attention to someone, that the communications sergeant who answered radios and got mocked in briefings was walking out into the Afghan desert to do something that would determine whether 480 men came home. She crossed the base perimeter without breaking stride. She began to climb. 4 minutes later, at 1423, the radio in the communications tent erupted with the sound that everyone who has worked in military communications will tell you they never get used to, not because it is louder than ordinary traffic, but because it carries a specific quality of panic that no amount of training ever fully disguises. Contact. Contact heavy. Eastern Ridgeline. RPG's machine gun fire. We are pinned. Vehicles burning. Casualties. We need... The transmission broke up. A second voice closer to the microphone. Southern approach is closed. Repeat, southern approach is closed. We have no exit. A third voice somewhere in the background, not speaking into a radio but audible on the transmission anyway, in the specific unguarded register of a man who has run out of trained responses and arrived at something more fundamental. Screaming. Private Whitmer pressed his headset against both ears with both hands and looked at the empty chair where Sarah Voss had been sitting 4 minutes ago. He looked at the back corner of the tent where the rifle case had been stored for 7 weeks. The case was gone. On the western ridge, 1,900 meters from the base perimeter, Sarah Voss was climbing through broken rock in the afternoon heat, carrying a rifle and 600 rounds of ammunition and a green notebook that a colonel had thrown in the trash, moving toward the only position from which the mathematics of this situation could be changed. She had known this was coming. She had prepared for this. And now there was nothing left to do but get to the ridge before it was too late for preparation to matter. The western ridge rose 280 feet above the valley floor, over 1,900 meters of ground that had no interest in being crossed quickly. Sarah crossed it anyway. The terrain was the kind that looks navigable from a distance and reveals itself as something else entirely. Once you are inside it, loose shale that shifted under every step. Rock formations that required hands and knees to clear, stretches of exposed ground where the afternoon sun came down, at an angle that turned the air above the surface into something you could almost see bending. She was carrying the M40 rifle case, a pack with 600 rounds of .308 ammunition, and the green notebook pressed flat against her chest inside her uniform. She moved at the pace that experienced people move through difficult terrain under time pressure, not running, which wastes energy and breaks ankles on loose rock, but faster than anyone who had watched her leave the base would have believed possible. Controlled. Economic. Each step placed with the automatic precision of a body that has learned to navigate difficult ground the way other people navigate familiar rooms. She reached the first viable position at 1444. She lay down behind the rock formation, opened the rifle case, and spent 45 seconds looking through the scope at the valley below. She rejected the position. The angle to the eastern ridgeline was wrong. She could see portions of the engagement from here, burning vehicles on the valley floor. The scattered defensive positions of Marines who had been caught moving and were now pressed against whatever cover existed, which was not much, but the northern ridgeline, where the machine gun traffic on her radio was loudest and most sustained, fell outside her effective firing arc by approximately 15 degrees. 15 degrees was not a rounding error. 15 degrees was the difference between a shot she could make and a shot that did not exist. She picked up the rifle case and moved. 300 meters further along the ridge spine, climbing her thighs, burning with the specific deep ache of muscle pushed past its comfortable range, she found the second position at 1451, a natural rock formation that provided both concealment and a stable firing platform. She lay down behind it. She assembled the M40 in the order she had assembled it approximately 10,000 times, stock action barrel scope, without looking at her hands, because her hands already knew. They had always known. The 10,000 repetitions had moved the knowledge out of her conscious mind and into something more reliable. She pressed her eye to the scope. The valley opened up below her. She looked at it for a long moment without moving. Then she opened her green notebook to the page she had written that morning, the elevation, the wind, the engagement distances, and she checked her numbers against what the scope was showing her. Wind 7 miles per hour northwest, adjusted down from her morning reading. Elevation 2,290 feet at her current position. Primary target zone 940 to 1,080 meters. She found the first machine gun position on the northern ridgeline. She watched it for 40 seconds, timing the burst pattern, identifying the rhythm, locating the gunner's position relative to the muzzle flash, calculating the holdover required for the distance and the wind and the angle and the atmospheric conditions at this elevation at this time of day in this specific light. She exhaled slowly. She squeezed the trigger. Down in the valley, Corporal Max Solvay had his face pressed against the wheel well of a disabled Humvee and was doing the thing he always did when he was scared, which was count. He had been counting the burst cycles of the northern machine gun for 11 minutes. Not because counting helped exactly, it did not help in any practical sense, but because his brain needed something to hold on to, and the rhythm of the gun was the only pattern available. 14 rounds, pause, 14 rounds, pause, with a mechanical consistency that was in its own way more frightening than randomness would have been. Randomness suggested chaos. This suggested someone who knew what they were doing and had enough ammunition to keep doing it indefinitely. He was at count 7 of the 8th cycle when the gun stopped. Not at the end of a burst. In the middle of one, mid-sentence, mid-thought, just stopped. Solvay pressed himself harder against the Humvee and waited for the cycle to resume. 5 seconds. 10. Private Owen Detch, pressed against the same wheel well from the other side, had gone completely still. "You hear that?" Solvay said. He did not raise his voice above a whisper. "The gun stopped," Detch said. Neither of them said anything else. They waited for it to start again. It did not start again. 11 minutes had passed since the first contact report, when Staff Sergeant Cal Pruitt walked into the communications tent and found Private Whitmer at his console, with the specific expression of a man managing more information than his training had prepared him for, and Private Kurt Hadley on the secondary frequency, trying to reach battalion command at the rear staging area with increasingly fragmented success. Pruitt looked at the consoles. He looked at the radio traffic board. He looked at the back corner of the tent where Sarah's rifle case had sat for 7 weeks. The corner was empty. He stood completely still for 3 seconds. "Where is Sergeant Voss?" he said. Whitmer answered without looking up. "Saw her walk out maybe 12 minutes ago," Staff Sergeant thought she was she carrying anything? Was she? A pause. Whitmer looked up now, registering something in Pruitt's voice that cut through the noise. "Rifle case, I think. And she took a radio from the equipment rack." Pruitt looked at the equipment rack. One handheld was missing. He went outside and looked toward the western ridge. 2 kilometers of open ground between the base perimeter and the ridgeline, broken and rocky and rising steadily. He shaded his eyes and looked for a long time. He could not see her. That was either very good or very bad, and he stood there long enough to decide it was probably both. He went back inside to do what he could from where he was, which was considerably less than what he understood she was already doing from hers. Sarah worked. The 2nd machine gun position on the eastern ridgeline. An RPG team she had identified during her initial scope survey, 2 men launcher and reload positioned behind a rock formation at approximately 1,040 meters. They were preparing to fire into a cluster of Marines who had moved away from the burning vehicles and were attempting to establish a defensive line in the open ground near the valley center, which was the right tactical decision and also the decision that was about to get them killed. She exhaled. She fired. The launcher operator went down. The second man, the one with the reload, stood completely still for 2 seconds staring at his partner, and then he ran. He took the reload with him. The cluster of Marines in the open ground was still alive 30 seconds later when they should not have been. In the command center at the base, Colonel Stanton Brielles stood at the main radio console and listened to the traffic from the valley and understood with the cold, compressing clarity of a man watching a thing he was told would not happen in the process of happening, that the situation was beyond what he had prepared for. He had air support 42 minutes out. Artillery authorization would take 90 minutes through regional command. His convoy was pinned in terrain that Sarah Voss had described to him in precise detail 36 hours ago using a notebook he had thrown against a wall. He stood very straight and looked at the radio and said nothing. At 14:51 through the scope at 2,290 feet, Sarah was on her 7th shot. Her process had become the entirety of what she was. There was no room in it for anything else. Not the altitude, not the heat, not the sound of the radio traffic coming through her earpiece at low volume, not the 7 weeks of being called dead weight, not the 11-week investigation that had ended in a written counseling statement while she was handed a lateral transfer. None of it existed inside the scope. Inside the scope, there was only distance and wind and the arithmetic of physics in the work. She found the next target. She ran the calculation. She fired. Move position immediately 10 meters to the right, because a sniper who fires from the same point twice is a sniper who gets located, settled, found the next target, ran. The calculation fired. The pattern of enemy positions going silent was not immediately understood by the men in the valley below. It registered first as confusion. One gun stops equipment malfunction maybe, or a shooter repositioning. A second goes silent coincidence possibly. By the third and fourth coincidence had exhausted itself as an explanation, but no alternative explanation was available, because the ridge from which the shots were coming was not supposed to have anyone on it. It was not on any movement order, it was not in any briefing, it was just a ridge. 12 meters from where Captain Wes Darrow Lima, 63 years old, Portland, Oregon, was pressed behind a disabled vehicle with two of his squad leaders managing an evolving situation with the compressed economical communication of an officer who has accepted that the situation is bad and has stopped hoping it will improve on its own and is now focused entirely on keeping it from becoming worse. The radio produced something that none of them had heard in the previous 31 minutes of this engagement. Silence where a gun should have been. Darrow lifted his head by 2 inches. Looked in the direction of the silence. Then his radio told him that the RPG position on the eastern ridge had also gone quiet. He looked at his squad leader, Sergeant Vince Hadwell. Hadwell looked back at him. "Someone is working that ridge," Darrow said. Neither of them knew who. In the command center, Major Clifton Fenn was on the phone with Regional Command when Brielles touched his arm and pointed at the radio traffic board. The pattern was there if you knew how to read it, and Brielles, whatever else he was, had 26 years of reading patterns in combat situations. The enemy positions were going quiet in a sequence that was not random. North, then east, then north again, then a mortar position on the western approach. Each silence arriving at intervals that suggested movement between shots. Repositioning. Someone working a target list with systematic, deliberate precision. Brielles said, "Pull up Voss's file." Fenn set the phone down. He found the personnel record in under 30 seconds. He opened it. He read the sniper qualification scores. He read Hooper's assessment, 19 years most precise long-range marksmanship. He scrolled down to the assignment history. He found the reassignment. He found the operational designation communications specialist. He opened the classified attachment. He read it. He turned the screen so Brielles could see it. Ghost 7-2. Removed from frontline rotation following internal political review. Reinstatement denied at command level. Performance metrics redacted from standard personnel file. Brielles read it once. He read it a second time. He set the printed page down on the console very carefully, the way you set down something that has weight beyond its physical mass. He stood with his hands flat on the console surface and looked at the radio traffic board where the enemy positions were continuing to go quiet in their careful, systematic sequence. "Nos Vos Fenn," said quietly. Brielles said nothing. Outside 40 kilometers away, Sarah Voss was on her 14th shot. She had been working for 23 minutes when the enemy began to understand what was happening to them. It took them that long because the suppressed rifle and her constant repositioning had prevented any reliable location fix. In combat, an enemy you cannot find is an enemy you cannot counter. But by the fourth and fifth time a position went silent without explanation, the pattern became undeniable, and the insurgent commander, whoever occupied that role after Sarah's 16th shot, removed the individual who had been occupying it, began pulling fighters back from the exposed ridgeline positions toward more concealed ground. Sarah recognized it immediately. It was the right tactical response. It was also the wrong outcome for the Marines in the valley because the fighters pulling back from the ridgelines were not disengaging. They were repositioning toward the extraction corridor, the southern approach that represented the only viable exit route, moving to seal the gap while it still existed. She keyed the radio. "Pruitt," she said. "They're repositioning. 15 to 20 fighters moving off the ridgelines toward the southern approach. I can slow it, but not stop it from this angle." Pruitt's voice came back immediately. "How long does Lima 6 need?" She heard him checking with the command center. A 3-second pause. 12 minutes to get all personnel to the extraction point. Sarah looked at her notebook. She looked at her remaining ammunition. She did the arithmetic that snipers do, not optimistically, not pessimistically, but accurately, because accuracy is the only version of the calculation that keeps people alive. "Yes," she said, "but I need to move. I'm going to lose comms for 4 minutes. Don't call me." "Copy," Pruitt said. She was already moving. The 400 meters along the ridge spine was the most exposed movement she had made. Repositioning between shots was one thing, 10 meters 15 staying within the same general firing position. 400 meters along an open ridgeline with fighters who had been scanning for her location for the past 20 minutes and had narrowed the search area considerably was a different calculation entirely. She went fast and she went low and she used every piece of available cover and she went to ground twice when movement on the eastern ridge suggested she might have been spotted. She had not been spotted. Or if she had, they had not yet acted on it. She reached the new position with her thighs burning and her breath coming hard and the specific focused calm of someone operating at the absolute edge of their capability and finding that the edge is further out than they knew. She settled. She ran her reset sequence scope position bone support natural point of aim and found the eastern ridge reverse slope in her optic. The mortar team was exactly where the terrain said it would be. 2 men tube mortar partially concealed behind a rock formation that had looked impenetrable from her previous position and was not impenetrable from here. They had positioned themselves with confidence, knowing that the western ridge was not supposed to have anyone on it, knowing that this angle was not supposed to exist. They were wrong about that. She keyed the radio, eyes on, engaging. She did not wait for a response. The shot broke at 15:15. Captain West Darrow heard the mortar rhythm break. He had been tracking it for 11 minutes, 90 seconds between rounds, patient and methodical, the signature of experienced operators who understood they had time and their target did not. He was experienced enough to know the difference between a pause in the rhythm and a termination of it. This was a termination. He sent a 2-man scout team forward along the southern approach. 30 meters, 40, 50. No fire. "Approach is clear," the scout reported. "Say again, approach is clear." Darrow allowed himself exactly 1 second of something that was not quite relief, but was its immediate physiological predecessor the moment the body dares to consider that the worst outcome is not inevitable. Then he was on the radio. All stations. All stations. Move. Southern approach. Wounded first. Move now. Wounded. In the command center, Brielle stood at the console and heard the extraction order go out and heard the acknowledgments come back and heard the first squad report moving, and he exhaled, not relief because relief was premature and he knew it, but the specific release of a man who has watched something terrible and is now watching something that might still be recoverable. Clifton Fenn stood beside him and said nothing because there was nothing to say. She had repositioned again another 200 meters north better angle on the Western Valley wall, and she was managing ammunition with the economy of someone who knows exactly how many rounds remain and what each one needs to accomplish. She kept the log between shots. Not because she needed the log to maintain accuracy. Her accuracy did not require a written record, but because the act of recording kept her mind organized the way that cleaning a rifle kept her hands organized. Process was stability. Stability was performance. Shot 17. Machine gun operator Northern Valley Wall, 1,020 meters, confirmed. Shot 18. Runner carrying ammunition between positions, 880 meters, confirmed. Shot 19. The pattern of repositioning fighters moving toward the extraction corridor, she had been tracking 3 of them, calculating their movement rates, projecting their arrival at the choke point. She took the nearest one at 640 meters, and the other 2 adjusted their routes instinctively, buying the extraction column another 90 seconds it needed. At 15:19, a round fired by someone on the eastern ridge impacted a rock face 60 centimeters to Sarah's left. The impact sent fragments in multiple directions. One of them, a piece of rock approximately 4 centimeters long with an irregular edge, went through the sleeve of her uniform and opened a 6-inch laceration across her left forearm. The cut was deep enough to bleed seriously and not deep enough to be immediately life-threatening, which was the most favorable version of the situation available. She pressed her left hand against her forearm. She kept her right hand on the rifle. She opened her notebook with 2 fingers of her left hand and wrote, "Position compromised. Fragment wound left forearm, 4 rounds remaining. Shooter northeast approximately 600 meters. Wind shifted 9 miles per hour northwest." She looked at the numbers. 4 rounds. 1 shooter who had her general position. 2 fighters still moving toward the extraction corridor. An unknown number of additional personnel who might be converging on her location. She ran the arithmetic. The shooter who had located her was moving. She could hear it the way she heard everything she could not see, through inference, through the interpretation of sounds that did not belong. A dislodged rock. A boot against hard surface. Movement that was trying to be quiet, and was nearly quiet, which is different from quiet when you have spent years training your hearing with the same attention you bring to training your eyes. He was moving north along the eastern ridge, trying to get a better angle. She calculated his rate and direction and projected his position in 30 seconds if he maintained his pace and course. She moved the scope to that position. She waited. He appeared exactly where the calculation said he would be. For a fraction of a second, she had the cold, specific satisfaction of mathematics working out a projection made under pressure in difficult conditions, proving itself accurate at the moment it mattered most. She breathed out. She squeezed the trigger. 3 rounds left. The radio crackled, Pruitt's voice slightly breathless from climbing. "Voss, come in. Voss, this is Pruitt." She keyed the radio with her right-hand eye still on the scope. "Copy, Pruitt. I'm here." The exhale on his end was audible even through the compression of the radio signal. "You're alive." "Currently," she said. "Fragment wound left arm not critical. 3 rounds remaining and I've been located. What's your position approximately 800 meters below you on the western approach? 12 to 15 minutes from your position." "Copy." "When you get within 400 meters, go to ground and wait for my signal. I don't know what's between you and me right now." "Understood." "Are you mobile?" She tested her left arm. The bleeding had slowed pressure and adrenaline doing the work that pressure and adrenaline do, but the muscle was not fully reliable. Walking was a different question from lying still. "I'll manage," she said. "Get here." She closed the channel. She scanned the terrain below and to the east and identified 3 fighters converging on her position from different angles, not converging randomly but in a pattern that suggested a specific instruction had been given. Find the shooter. They had lost the shooter who had located her, but they knew the approximate area, and they were moving toward it from 3 directions simultaneously, which is the correct tactical response to a sniper in a known general location. She watched them through the scope and ran the numbers. 3 targets. 3 rounds, 3 different approach angles. She could take the nearest one cleanly from her current position. The second would require a repositioning that her left arm might not support at the level of precision the distance required. The third, approaching from the north along the ridge spine, was behind terrain that blocked any shot she could make from anywhere in this section of the ridge without exposing herself completely. She stayed still. The specific absolute stillness that is the most active thing a sniper does. The controlled suppression of every instinct that says, move, react, do something in favor of the discipline that says, wait, watch, choose the right moment because the right moment is coming and the wrong moment will cost everything. The radio. Pruitt's voice low. "We're at 400 meters. What do you need?" She kept her voice as quiet as she could manage. 3 contacts converging. The northern approach is the problem. No shot from current position. If you have eyes on the northern ridge spine 300 meters above your position, I need to know what's up there. Movement on the other end. Then a different voice. Garnett, it turned out, with binoculars already raised. "One individual," Garnett said. "Moving south along the spine. I make it 310, maybe 320 meters above us." Pruitt relayed the position. Sarah moved the scope. She found him. She fired. 2 rounds left. Pruitt's voice. "Northern contact is down," Copy, Sarah said. 2 remaining eastern approach. Stand by." She found the second fighter. She fired. 1 round. She found the third. She calculated the wind shift 9 miles per hour, now adjusted, settled. Her right hand pressed her left forearm against the rock, despite the pain because she needed every point of contact she could get. She fired. And then there was a different silence. Not the silence between shots, not the silence of repositioning, the silence of a target list that has reached its final entry, the silence of completed work. Pruitt waited 10 seconds. "Voss, talk to me." She lay still behind the rock for a moment. Her left arm was throbbing, her right hand was steady. The valley below was producing a different kind of radio traffic now, not the fractured, desperate transmissions of men pinned without options, but the compressed, urgent traffic of men moving, which is a meaningful distinction in combat, even if it does not sound like one from the outside. "Position clear," she said. "I'm mobile. Coming down." The exhale on Pruitt's end had the quality of something that had been held for a very long time, finding a partial release. Below her 800 meters down the western approach, she heard Garnett lower the binoculars. She began to climb down toward them. The extraction did not look like anything you would put in a training manual. It looked like organized chaos at its most functional, which is to say it looked like chaos, but it was moving in the right direction, which in combat is the only definition of organized that matters. squads pushing through the southern approach in leapfrog patterns, the walking wounded supporting the non-walking wounded Marines, laying down suppressive fire toward ridgeline positions that had gone quiet for reasons none of them fully understood. Yet the entire column held together by training and the specific unreasonable stubbornness that the Marine Corps selects for over decades of institutional pressure. Captain Wes Darrow ran it from the middle of it. He was 31 years old, and he had a daughter named Claire who was 9 and who ran toward him with her arms fully extended whenever he came home, the way children run before they learn that throwing yourself completely at something carries risk. He had been thinking about Claire at irregular intervals since 1423. Not continuously combat does not permit continuous thinking about anything except the immediate problem. But in the gaps between decisions, in the fraction of a second between one transmission and the next, her face appeared with the specific clarity of something a person is not prepared to lose. He pushed his squads through the gap and counted them as they went. Bravo 2 clear, all present, Echo 3 clear, 4 walking wounded, 2 litter, Delta 6 clear, all present. The numbers climbed in the command center where Brielle stood at the radio console with his sleeves rolled up, something no one on that base had ever seen, tracking each report with the focused attention of a man who has decided he will not look away from this until it is finished. Whatever finished turns out to mean. Finn stood beside him. Neither of them spoke much. The radio did the talking. Outside, the base had transformed. The first extraction helicopters had begun landing, and the Marines coming off them moved with the specific physical signature of people who have been under sustained fire for over an hour, slightly too deliberate, slightly too careful. The automatic functions of movement replaced by something more conscious and more fragile. They came off the helicopters and stood on the landing pad and breathed the base air, which smelled like diesel and dust, and was the most straightforward thing any of them had experienced in the past 90 minutes. Corporal Max Solvay came off the second helicopter with Private Owen Detch beside him, both of them still carrying their weapons, because the instinct to hold the rifle does not leave immediately after the shooting stops. Solvay stood on the landing pad and breathed and looked at the western ridge without deciding to look at it. His eyes just went there, the way eyes go toward the place where something important happened. "She's still up there," he said. "Not a question." Detch followed his gaze. Someone went to get her. Pruitt left with a team. They stood there without saying anything else, looking at the ridge in the late afternoon light. The count reached 472 at 1524, then 475, then 478, then 479, and stopped. In the command center, the radio kept producing traffic squad leaders checking in, corpsmen reporting casualty status, the logistical noise of a large unit completing a movement under fire. But under all of it, Brielle's heard the count stop at 479, and he knew immediately why it had stopped, and the knowing of it settled into him like something physical. Darrow's voice came through controlled and flat, in the way that a man's voice goes flat when he is managing something that has moved past the range of normal emotional response. "Command, this is Lima 6, requesting final count confirmation. We are showing 479 personnel at the extraction point." Brielle's picked up the handset. "Lima 6, you are one short," he said. A pause from the valley that lasted long enough to have weight. "I know, sir," Darrow said. "The shooter on the ridge. We don't have her in the count." Brielle's closed his eyes. He kept them closed for 11 seconds. The command center was very quiet during those 11 seconds. Not the quiet of an empty room, but the specific weighted quiet of a room full of people who understand exactly what is being calculated and exactly whose accounting is responsible for the number that should be 480 and is not. Finn did not move. Whitmer and Hadley at their consoles did not move. The 3 other officers in the room looked at things that were not each other. Brielle's opened his eyes. The rifle on the western ridge had gone silent 6 minutes ago. No one knew why. "Get me a helicopter on that ridge," Brielle said. "Now." Finn was already moving toward the secondary console. "Sir, we still have active personnel in the area." "The approach I did not ask for a threat assessment, Clifton." Finn picked up the handset. From the back of the command center, where he had been standing with his arms crossed and his jaw set, in the configuration of a man exercising considerable self-control, Pruitt spoke. "Sir, I'll go up on foot. I know the bearing she took. I can backtrack her route." Briels looked at him. "You are not going alone. Then give me 2 men and a corpsman. A beat." In other circumstances, at a different moment, Briels might have run through the protocol authorization risk assessment command approval chain. Instead, he said, "Take Garnett, take Detch, take Kessler from the medical unit." Pruitt was out the door before Briels finished the sentence. Garnett had been sitting on an equipment crate outside the command center when Pruitt found him. He had been sitting there since he came off the 3rd helicopter, and the people who had seen him sitting there had left him alone because his face had the look of someone doing private arithmetic that no one else should interrupt. He was 22 years old, and he had spent the last 90 minutes behind a burning Humvee counting machine gun burst cycles and praying to whatever version of God was available, and he had come off that helicopter and been told by a man in his squad who had seen Pruitt leave the communications tent that the shooter on the ridge was Sarah Voss. That the communications sergeant who answered radios and got mocked in briefings had gone up that ridge alone without authorization and kept 480 men alive. That the woman he called dead weight was the reason any of them were standing on this base right now instead of lying in a valley 40 kilometers away. He had been sitting with that for 20 minutes. He stood up when Pruitt appeared and did not ask any questions and followed without being told twice. They moved fast up the western approach Pruitt, Garnett, Detch, and Corpsman Ray Kessler, covering the lower section of the ridge at a pace that none of them would have described as comfortable. Garnett carried the binoculars. He did not speak. His silence on the way up was not his usual silence, which was the silence of someone who does not feel the need to fill space. It was the silence of someone who has had something taken apart inside them and is not yet sure what the rebuilt version is going to look like. At 400 meters below the ridgeline, Pruitt stopped the team and keyed his radio. "Voss, we're at 400. Talk to me." Her voice came back quieter than before, not lower in volume exactly, but compressed. The voice of someone managing sound output with deliberate care. "3 contacts converging on my position. Northern approach is the problem. No shot from current position. If you have eyes on the northern ridge spine, 300 meters above your position, I need to know what's up there." Garnett already had the binoculars up. He scanned the northern ridge spine without being asked, because whatever else the last 90 minutes had rearranged in him, they had not touched his ability to do the immediate work in front of him. "One individual," he said, "moving south along the spine, 310, maybe 320 meters above us." Pruitt relayed it. There was a silence from Sarah's end that lasted 4 seconds. Then a single shot from somewhere above and to the south of their position. Garnett watched the northern ridge spine. The individual he had been tracking was no longer moving. "Down," Garnett said quietly. 2 more shots came in the following 14 seconds. Then a silence that was different from all the silences that had come before it. Not a pause, not a repositioning. The silence of completion. Pruitt waited 10 seconds. "Voss, talk to me." Her voice came back, and it had something in it that had not been there for the previous hour. Not relief, exactly, not triumph, but a release. The sound of a mechanism that has been operating at maximum tension and has been permitted to ease by a single degree. "Position clear," she said. "I'm mobile. Coming down." Garnett lowered the binoculars. He stood for a moment looking at the ridgeline above them. His jaw moved in the way that jaws move when someone is working toward something they have not yet found the shape of. He said nothing. They started climbing toward her. She came down to meet them. She appeared on the ridgeline above their position, moving carefully on the loose shale, her left arm held slightly away from her body where Kessler could see the field dressing. She had applied herself pressure bandage over the laceration, taped with the supplies from the small kit she carried. Not adequate. Adequate enough. She was still carrying the M40. She was still carrying the green notebook. Kessler reached her first and moved her arm into better light and looked at the dressing and then at her face, and then at the dressing again. Pruitt came up on her left. Garnett took her right without being asked, positioning himself to take weight if the terrain required it on the way down. She looked at Garnett briefly when he moved into position beside her. She did not say anything, neither did he. They descended in silence. Pruitt on her left, Garnett on her right, Kessler behind them monitoring her color and her breathing, Detch out ahead, finding the clearest line through the shale. The afternoon light was going toward evening now, the hard angle of the sun softening slightly, the ridge casting a shadow eastward across the valley where the burning vehicles had stopped burning, and the smoke was thinning against the sky. She came through the base perimeter at 15:58. The word had been moving through the base for 20 minutes before she walked through the gate. It moves fast in small military installations, especially when the story is the kind that people cannot stop repeating to themselves, the kind that reorganizes how you understand what just happened. Within half an hour of the first returning squads, everyone on that base knew two things. The shooter on the ridge was Sarah Voss, and Sarah Voss had not yet come back. The Marines who had come off the helicopters were standing in groups in the way that people stand after something has moved through them that has not finished moving yet, talking in the rapid, slightly too loud way that the body uses to metabolize fear after the fear has passed. But when Sarah came through the perimeter gate with Pruitt on her left and Garnett on her right, the talking in those groups went quiet. Not the dismissive quiet of her arrival 7 weeks ago. Something else, something that had direction and weight and moved toward a point rather than away from one. Solveig saw her first. He was sitting on the ground near the landing pad with his back against an equipment crate, and he got to his feet without deciding to the way a person stands up for something without making a conscious choice to stand. He looked at her. This woman, who was 5'4" and covered in dust and dried blood and was carrying a rifle and a notebook and walking with the careful, deliberate stride of someone who has used everything they had and is now conserving what remains. He thought about the machine gun that stopped in the middle of a burst cycle. He thought about the gap in the southern approach that had opened at the exact moment when there was no other option left. He thought about running through that gap with the sound of a rifle shot from the ridge, arriving at the same instant a figure 20 meters in front of him dropped and the gap staying open and him making it through. One person, Detch had said, back behind the Humvee. He stood there with his mouth slightly open and no words in any language that would do the work he needed them to do. Captain Wes Darrow had come off his helicopter, still in the same dust-covered uniform he had been wearing in the valley, his right shoulder wrapped in a field dressing from a graze that he had not mentioned to anyone since a corpsman had applied it at the landing zone. He had walked directly into the command center without stopping. He had stood in front of Brielle's. The two men had looked at each other the way men look at each other after something that has moved the floor. Did we know, Darrow had said? His voice was level. Did someone know how good she was and put her on radios anyway? Brielle said, read her file, Captain. The classified section. Fenn had handed him the printed sheet. Darrow read it. His face moved through the same sequence of expressions that Brielle's had moved through the layered, complicated sequence that ends somewhere without a clean name. We did this, Darrow said. Not an accusation. A statement of fact which was somehow more difficult than an accusation. We put Ghost 7-2 on a radio desk. Nobody in the room disagreed with him. Now he crossed the compound toward the gate as Sarah came through it, moving with the directness of a man who has been composing something for the past 40 minutes and has accepted that the words are not going to be adequate and is going to say them anyway. He stopped in front of her. He was 6'1". She was 5'4". He outranked her by 4 pay grades. None of that was the relevant information, and they both knew it. I was Lima 6, he said. I know, she said. He looked at her with the direct, unguarded look that combat produces in people, the look that strips away institutional distance and sees the person standing in front of it. I have a daughter, he said. Her name is Claire. She's 9. He stopped. Started again. I would like to go home and see Claire. That was not a certainty 2 hours ago. The reason it became a certainty is you. He stopped again. The stopping had the quality of a man who has reached the limit of what language can carry and is standing at that limit. I don't have adequate words for what I want to say to you, he said. I just need you to know that I know, and every man who came off that ridge today knows. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, How's your shoulder, sir? Darrow blinked. Then something happened in his face that surprised him, a short, genuine sound that was not the laugh of a man who finds something funny, but the laugh of a man who has had something released in him that needed releasing. It's fine, he said. Thank you for asking. He stepped back. He came to attention. And then Captain Wes Darrow, commanding officer of Lima Company, a man with combat experience and institutional authority that had been entirely beyond Sarah Voss's reach for the past 7 weeks, rendered a salute. It was not a casual salute. It was deliberate, precise. The kind that means something past protocol, the kind that is not a gesture, but a statement. She returned it. He held his for a beat longer than required. Then he dropped it and nodded once and stepped aside. Behind him, without any signal, without any coordination, the salutes began. Not all at once. Not in a choreographed sequence. One by one, the way truth moves through a group of people who have just encountered it directly, each person making their own decision in their own time, the decision arriving at different moments for different men, some of them immediately and some of them after a pause. That was the pause of a person locating something in themselves they needed to locate before they could act. Salve. Detch. 3 men from Delta 6 who had run through the southern corridor in the final extraction lift. A sergeant from Bravo 2 who had been the first squad through the gap. A lance corporal who had been pinned beside a burning vehicle for 40 minutes and had heard at the moment when the mortar fire should have closed in, and did not the distant compressed crack of a suppressed rifle from a ridge that was not supposed to have anyone on it. Each of them rendered it. Each of them meant it. Sarah stood still and returned each one. Her face did not change. If you were watching from a distance, you might have thought she was unmoved. You would have been wrong. She was moved in a place that faces cannot reach, in the place where the things that actually matter to a person live underneath the professional discipline and the 7 weeks of dead weight and the 11-week investigation and the lateral transfer and the sealed file. And every hour she had spent in that communications tent, maintaining precision for a role the institution had decided she was not permitted to perform. She was moved in that place. She just did not show it because showing it felt like the wrong response to something this serious. Colonel Stanton Brielles crossed the compound at 1617. He had nothing in his hands, no document, no instrument of official action, just himself and 26 years and whatever he had worked out in the hour he had spent standing at the radio console, watching 480 Marines come home from a place they should not have been able to come home from. The groups of Marines nearby created space as he approached the involuntary physical acknowledgement of senior rank that years of conditioning produce without requiring conscious thought. He walked through that space and stopped in front of Sarah. He looked at her for a moment. "Sergeant Voss," he said. "Sir?" "You disobeyed a direct order," he said. "You left your post without authorization. You operated outside your assigned role without command approval." His voice was even, not accusatory, factual. "Yes, sir," Sarah said. "All of that is accurate." He held her gaze. "I'm going to need a full written account of your actions today," he said. "Every shot, every position, every decision point. I want it documented completely and formally." "I have the log, sir," she said. She touched the front pocket of her uniform where the green notebook was. Something moved across his face at that. The notebook. She had reached into his trash can and taken it back. He knew she had done it. He was not sure even now whether he deserved to be surprised by it. "I know," he said quietly. "I know you do." He was quiet for a moment. Around them the base was still in the specific way it gets still when people are pretending not to listen while absolutely listening. 480 Marines came back today, Brielle said. Not 479, not 450, 480. 0 left behind. He paused. "That number is yours, Sergeant. Every single one of those 480 came home because of what you did on that ridge, without authorization, without support, with a fragment wound in your arm and 4 rounds left and 3 contacts converging on your position." Sarah said nothing. "I owe you an apology," Brielle said. The compound was extremely quiet. "The notebook," he said. "What I did with it in that briefing room. What I said. The way this command has treated your assessment, your record, your capability." He stopped. He was not a man who apologized easily. You do not reach colonel in the Marine Corps by being emotionally accessible, and the effort of it showed in the way he worked through the words, like a man walking carefully on ground he has not walked before. "I was wrong. Not just tactically wrong, though I was that. I was wrong about you. I dismissed you because of what I assumed, and those assumptions nearly cost me 480 Marines." Sarah looked at him steadily. "I understand, sir," she said. "I don't need you to understand," he said. "I need you to hear that it will not happen again, not in my command." He straightened slightly. "Effective immediately, I am submitting a formal request to reinstate your operational sniper designation and reverse the political reassignment in your file. I want Ghost 7-2 on my frontline roster." The quiet around them deepened. Sarah held his gaze for a moment. "Sir," she said, "permission to speak freely. Granted." That recommendation has been made before, she said, by instructors, by evaluators, by commanding officers at 2 previous postings. The recommendations went into files that were sealed. The reassignments happened anyway. Her voice was not angry. It was not bitter. It was the voice of a person who has learned to be precise about things that matter, because precision is what survives. What makes this time different? Brielle's met her eyes. Because this time 480 men watched you do it, he said. Because this time it is in every radio log, every after-action report, every account that Lima 6 and Bravo 2 and Delta 6 are going to file in the next 48 hours. Because this time, he said it with the quiet certainty of a man who has spent 26 years understanding how institutions work and has just located the one mechanism that this particular institution cannot override. It cannot be sealed. Sarah held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded. Once. Brielle's came to attention. He rendered a salute. It was the slowest salute anyone on that base had ever watched a colonel give, which meant it was the most deliberate, which meant it was the most genuine, which was the only version of a salute that meant anything beyond the physical movement of a hand. She returned it. He held his a beat longer than required. Then he dropped it. He stepped back. And for the first time in the 7 weeks she had been on that base, Colonel Stanton Briels looked at Sarah Voss the way you look at someone you have actually fully seen. Garnett found her in the armory at 1638. She was sitting on her stool with the M40 broken down on the workbench in front of her, working through the cleaning sequence. She always followed bolt chamber barrel stock, with the unhurried attention of someone who considers the maintenance of a tool an act of respect for what the tool has done. He stood in the doorway. She saw him and kept working because the rifle did not clean itself, and his discomfort was not her responsibility to manage. Carter, he said, then corrected himself. Voss. She did not look up. Garnett. He came inside. He did not sit because there was nowhere to sit, and sitting on the floor felt like the wrong register for whatever this was. He stood with his hands at his sides in the posture of a man who has rehearsed something and is now discovering that rehearsal and execution are 2 separate activities. I started it, he said. Dead weight. I said it first. He stopped. I need you to know that I'm not going to pretend I didn't. She set down the bolt and looked at him directly. She did not make it easy. She was not obligated to make it easy. She looked at him with the same measuring precision she brought to everything, and she let him stand in the silence, and she did not fill it for him. Phil, he said, in the valley. We were behind that Humvee. There was a machine gun on the north ridge that I had been counting for 11 minutes trying to find a gap I could move through, and then it just stopped, mid-burst. And I didn't understand why, and I found out an hour later that it stopped because you shot the gunner from 900 meters away. He stopped. His jaw was working. His jaw. I would have died behind that Humvee, he said, not being dramatic. The mortar team had our position bracketed. Another 4 minutes and we were gone. He looked at her with the raw, unguarded expression of someone whose defenses have been stripped by events too large to maintain defenses against. I called you dead weight, and you kept me alive. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you could start by not doing it again. Garnett stood with that for a second. Then something happened in him. Not a laugh exactly, but the sound that comes out of a person when pressure finds the only exit remaining to it. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I can do that. She picked up the bolt again. He understood that was the end of the conversation, not a dismissal, a completion. He turned toward the door. Garnett, she said. He stopped. You were watching your sector when they had you pinned behind that Humvee, she said. I could see it from the ridge. A lot of men in your position closed their eyes. You didn't. She returned to the bolt. That matters too, she said. He stood for a moment longer. Then he walked out and the armory was quiet again, and Sarah cleaned her rifle in the silence that she had always found more honest than noise. At 16:52, she finished. She set the M40 down on the workbench. She opened the green notebook to a fresh page, the page after the last entry after the 25th shot, and its distance and wind reading and timestamp. She wrote the date. She wrote the time. She wrote the atmospheric conditions because that was what she always wrote, the standard entry, the thing she did every day without exception. Then she looked at the page for a moment, and she wrote one more line, the kind of line she had never written in any notebook before because she had never had reason to write it. Because before today, the notebooks had always been private, always been personal, always been the record of a capability that the institution around her had refused to officially acknowledge. 480 Marines, 0 left behind. She looked at the line. She closed the notebook. She pressed it flat against her palm for a moment, feeling the cover worn at the corners, now slightly warped from the Afghan heat pages, thickened from the calculations she had run in the margins of every entry for 7 weeks. She put it in the front pocket of her uniform, where it always went, where it had always belonged, even when it was sitting in a trash can, even when a colonel had put it there. She picked up the M40. She stood. She walked out of the armory into the evening air, which had cooled while she was inside the desert, doing what deserts do when the sun goes down, releasing the heat. It is held all day with a sudden, complete indifference. The base around her was settling into the particular exhausted peace of a unit that has been through something together and is still processing what that something was. Helicopters quiet. Radios at normal volume. The sound of boots on gravel and the low conversation of men who are alive when they were not certain they were going to be finding their way back to the ordinary texture of an ordinary evening. She had done her job. That was all she had ever wanted to do. And on this day, in this valley, against every obstacle the institution had placed between her and the work she was capable of, she had done it completely. The proof was not in the salutes, though they had mattered. It was not in Briel's apology, though that had mattered too. It was not even in the reinstatement that he had promised, though she intended to hold him to it. The proof was in the count. 480 Marines came home, every single one. And the woman they called deadweight had carried them there.